order the Connecticut Education Preparation Certification Board on December 9th, 2024 at 1:06 p.m. Roll call. I do that, Chloe. Kristen? Here. Elsa will be coming late. Tiffany?
Here.
Jen Delaney?
Here.
Dr. Deshelle? Sarah? Here. Dr. Good? Here. Any Graves?
Here.
All the guns. Margaret? Here. Shannon?
Here.
Grace?
Here.
Dr. Ritchie? Here. Dr. Rowe? Rob? Here. Cynthia? Present. And me, Jen Rodriguez. You all have the agenda in front of you. To review the agenda, can I have a motion to approve the agenda?
I'll move to approve the agenda. That's Kristen Vestega.
May I have a second? Second. Any discussion? All those in favor, please raise your hand. 2 and 8. 8 in favor. Hard to tell.
Physically raise their hands often. Raise hand. Or you can,
So
raise your hand.
If you're not on camera, can you click the raise hand function? So we'll try that a quick. All those in favor, raise your hand. Eleven, 12. Any opposed? The abstentions? Motion passes. Approval of the minutes. Are there any corrections to the minutes as read? A moment to look them over. Hearing none, the minutes stand approved as read then. Right, moving right along. And a couple of announcements. We don't have formal announcements, but due to the hybrid nature, if you're not on camera, just use the raise your hand function for any questions or comments, and we'll try to kind of look between the two to make sure that we are ready for everything. Public participation will occur towards the end of the meeting, so please sign up. I think the sheet is out in the hallway on the table. And then is there an update on the administrators? And then committee reports. We're going to have our bylaws for the subcommittee towards the end of the meetings. So I don't think there's necessarily a committee report at this time. So we're going to move directly into items for discussion, which would be the CPRL presentation. We have our CPRL people here. We have
2 remotely.
So 2. Who is remote right now?
Liz and Scheherazade are remote.
Right. So Elizabeth 2 and Scheherazade's Amy is remote.
Yes.
And then I'm assuming that you are Benjamin.
Yes, that's me.
Okay.
This is my colleague Tong as well.
Perfect. So Carly is not here as part of this.
No, she's helping us with scheduling. She will not be attending.
Okay, perfect. I just wrote down all of the names Want to make sure.
Yeah, I know.
There's that accounted for. All right, so I'm going to hand off to you on the presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Can you all hear me okay in the room?
Yes. Yeah.
Great, wonderful. Well, thank you for inviting us today. We're happy to share a little bit about ourselves and some of the work that we've done on looking over the Ed certification and preparation regulations. If you go to the next slide, please. And the next slide after that, we're going to first share a little bit about us, and then we're going to turn over, I'm going to turn over the mic to my colleagues to speak more about the memo that was shared in advance of today's meeting. But a number of you might be wondering, who is CPERL? So we'll start there. CPERL is the Center for Public Research and Leadership. We are an education, research, leadership, and policy center housed at Columbia University. We live in Columbia Law School, but we are interdisciplinary in nature and are made up of the fields of law, business, policy, education, and data sciences. And so we have faculty, staff, and students from all of those disciplines, and all of those disciplines are brought to bear in the various research projects that we take on. As part of our work, we are not only sort of out in the world doing research, but we are very focused on generating and helping develop the next generation of talent, who will be all of you someday sitting in the seats, hopefully, that you're sitting in. And to date, since our founding, we've trained over 700 graduate students from those fields that I already mentioned. And cutting across all of our work is a focus on participatory decision-making, participatory action, participatory research. Next slide, please. Since our founding, we have done lots and lots of work in the state of Connecticut, I think every year since we were founded. The work that is probably most applicable to the conversation today, because a number of you might be wondering how we even got into this conversation around educator certification and preparation, goes back to our partnership with the Connecticut Innovation Cohort, which is a group that we launched in summer 2021 in partnership with the Superintendent's Association and a number of other folks across the state, trying to help systems coming out of the height of the pandemic that were very interested in trying to continue to transform themselves based on the experience they had during the pandemic with having to do things differently in order to try to meet every student's needs. As a group of systems, we decided not only to tackle local system innovation, but work together on research that would inform various statewide policy issues. And the educator workforce came up from the local systems as their priority research area very early on in our journey. And so we've been working on educator workforce issues together with local systems and actors across the state for over 3 years now. If you go to the next slide, please. We sort of chunk the work of the innovation cohort, and the reason why I'm bringing this up again is because this is where a lot of our educator workforce work lies into various clusters of years. So we are in a phase right now that we restarted over the summer, and the focus really is on professionalizing teaching and making sure that every local system has the educators they need to sustain the type of education that everyone in the system deserves. And so you'll see here on the slide some of the objectives of the cohort. And I know these slides, I think, are in front of you or will be distributed after the meeting. So you can take a look at it later. And of course, happy to answer any questions that you have. A number of you might be wondering which systems are participating in the cohort. So these are also in the deck for your reference. If you go to the next slide, please. And the last thing I'll say is that, so as part of this work of the cohort, ourselves and a number of the participants in the cohort were part of the CECC process that occurred over the course of the last year, of course, started and run by the state agency themselves. And so we were very excited to have been asked to be a part of that, both ourselves and others involved in the cohort. And so here's just some backstory. In talking to the State Department last week, they thought it might be helpful to have a little bit of backstory. I know you all have discussed this already about the CECC, but again, this sort of the way we experienced the invitation from the state agency was that the state was very interested in very rigorous dialogue around educator certification and preparation, very focused on getting lots of people involved in making decisions. The CECC's goal was to help modernize and align Connecticut's educator certification processes with the challenges of the moment, recognizing that this body of rule had not been sort of substantially tackled for a few decades, and so it was time to do that in a very sort of robust and inclusive way. As I said, we were part of that at the invitation of the state agency, along with a number of the other folks who were involved in the innovation cohort. And so that's sort of the overlap between those two bodies of work. And the CECC spent a number of meetings over the course of the fall through last spring, really digging deeply into a policy vision, and then thinking through how to translate that policy vision into, updates to the statute and the rules that govern the certification and preparation process in Connecticut. And that culminated with the passage of Public Act 2441. And as part of 2441, there were a number of regulations that were repealed, which brings us to our conversation today. And again, we're happy to talk more about CPRL or the backstory, though I know that the focus of the conversation today is really on the regulatory review. Scheherazade, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks. Before we dive into the substance of the memo that we circulated, we thought it might be helpful to just set a little bit more context. Liz started, I'll add on the idea for how the CEPCB came about and to go over the main responsibilities of the Standards Board and its authority as a semi-autonomous body. I'm just going to say the Standards Board instead of the full acronym because it's kind of a mouthful. But when I say Standards Board, I'm referring to CEPCB. So if you go to the next slide. So the Standards Board arose out of a CECC recommendation to create a state level board that could really do a couple of things. One is support the implementation of Connecticut's updated certification system as codified in the act that Liz just referred to, and crucially to also ensure ongoing improvement of that system. So the way the board was designed and the vision for how it is to function really reflects the need to ensure that the system is continually rooted in research and evidence, and that it's responsive to both new learnings and the evolving needs of educators and students. So if you move to the next slide, broadly, the Standards Board is responsible for modernizing Connecticut's system for educator preparation and certification to ensure that Connecticut can attract and retain effective and diverse professionals for the state's public schools. And one of the ways the Standards Board will do this is by developing either standards or proposals for legislation or regulations that will govern the system. So later on, we'll discuss the distinction between these three things. But one thing to mention here, since we're talking about what informed the design of this new system, is that there was a general idea, some of which you saw expressed on the previous slide, that we don't want to maintain a system that is rigid and inflexible. We also don't want a system that is overly complex and hard to understand. And instead, what we want is a system that can be flexible enough so that as we learn new things over time, it can improve on itself ongoing. So as the Standards Board decides, alongside the State Board, whether it wants to recommend action in the form of legislation, which obviously would have to be done by the legislature, or regulations or guidance, it will want to keep in mind the need for transparency, simplicity, and flexibility, and also the interest in creating a system that can learn and improve over time. So one more thing to note here, I think you've already covered some of this in your last meeting, but in terms of the Standards Board's responsibilities, there are a number of obligations under the Public Act. The most immediate ones that are coming up on you in a little bit over a month's time are to identify obsolete or conflicting provisions in the regs, which we're talking about today, and also to review the state's approach to assessing minimum content knowledge and to recommend potential alternatives. On the next slide, one more thing to note in terms of the design of the system. In terms of the standard board's authority, you probably already heard in the last meeting, but the board is semi-autonomous, which basically means that any standards or proposals for legislation or regulations developed by the standards board related to educator preparation and certification have to be approved by the State Board of Education. And then the converse is also true. So each body has 60 days to approve or reject any standard or proposal by the other. And then once approved by both bodies, it goes through the relevant process for adoption. So in the case of legislation, it would go to the legislature to go through the normal legislative process. For regulations, it would go through the normal regulatory adoption process. And then guidance capturing things like standards, for example, would just be issued without another formal process. On the next slide, this obviously begs the question of what the difference is between legislation, regulations, and guidance. And again, standards can be captured in things like guidance. So this slide gives you an overview of that. In the simplest of terms, and again, I think you went over some of this last time, but just to restate it, in the simplest of terms, legislation is an act codified in what's called a statute, passed by the Connecticut General Assembly. It is the highest form of law, so where there is inconsistency between a statute and regulation or guidance, the statute will prevail. Regulation is an agency statement that is meant to support typically implementation or operationalization of statutory requirements. And then guidance is used by agencies to advise or inform the public on how it understands a statute or regulation, or the way in which it will exercise its duties pursuant to a statute or a regulation. So the thing to notice here is that because guidance is not subject to formal rulemaking processes or procedures, it's relatively less static compared to statute or regulation, and can be a little bit more responsive to new learnings and experiences and changing conditions that arise. If you click ahead to a couple slides ahead to the regulatory review slide. So again, Public Act 24-41 gave the Standards Board the authority and obligation to review Connecticut's regulations on educator preparation and certification. But actually in the development of the act itself, there was a review of this type, and that's what we're going to walk through today. So on the next slide, if you can click ahead, I'm going to hand it over to Ben to walk through this in detail. But one of the reasons we created this memo is because we wanted to make more transparent work that had already been done by the legislation itself. There's a section in the legislation that has kind of like a long string of citations to regulations that are being sunset. It's obviously very hard from that to understand the cleanup and updating work that was already done. And so we wanted to just unpack all of that and make it really clear how the regulations have already, through this section in the Act, been tidied up and updated to reflect current requirements in legislation. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ben to walk us through that.
Thanks, Scheherazade. So you all should have this memo. What we're going to try to do is walk through the memo in more general terms. We're not going to go into the same level of detail or degree of granularity that's in the memo, but just want to give you a broad overview. So if you go to the next slide, please. There are essentially 4 main reasons why we believe through our analysis that the legislature repealed some certification regulations. Go to the next slide as well. The first is if they were contradicted by or redundant with the new law, 24-41. The second general category is those regulations that were either already overridden or were redundant with other sources of law prior to the passage of the act. It just needed to be cleaned up. We'll make reference to this several times, but the regulations were adopted in 1998 and had not been touched since then. So number of intervening acts of the legislation, and we just talked about how legislation supersedes contradicting regulations. So if there's ever a conflict between the law as passed by the General Assembly and regulations, the law prevails. So a number of the regulations had functionally already been overridden by the acts undertaken by the legislature over the 26 years since the regulations adoption. So a number of the regulations that were identified for repeal had already functionally been mooted by the legislature. So those were being picked up. The third category is these prescriptive program requirements. So if they prescribed EPP coursework requirements in a way that the CECC had found in its deliberations would hinder the program's flexibility to respond to teacher candidates' needs. And then fourth were some provisions that were time-bound and had either expired or contained references to outdated language or programs that no longer exist within Connecticut's education system. So we'll go into a little bit of detail. The memo goes again into greater detail, but if you'll go to the next slide, please. So the first set of regs that were identified for repeal were those that were superseded by this act of the legislature, so 24-41. So the new law from last session established a two-tier licensure framework, eliminating the provisional certificate and simplifying the educator certification system. So a number of the regulations that were identified for repeal were those that spoke to the eligibility criteria for provisional certificates. The law also changed some endorsement grade spans, making elementary endorsements valid for pre-K through grade 6, secondary content area endorsements valid down through 4th grade to accommodate the wide variety of existing middle school grade setups. So again, some of the regulations conflicted with this two-tier licensure framework. And then the third were a set of regulations that were just inconsistent with the new certification landscape and were repealed accordingly. So next slide, please. So this is the whole panoply of regulations that had already functionally been overridden over the past quarter century. So regulations that were put out in 1998 and then through a number of intervening legislative sessions had functionally already been overridden. So again, these are detailed in the memo, but some of these address coursework, student teaching and assessment requirements for prospective teachers, regulations that address how educators maintain their professional licensure. So, references to continuing education units that are no longer part of the legislative, approach to maintaining professional licensure. Regulations concerning eligibility for special education and bilingual education endorsements, again, that have been updated via legislation over the past decade or so. And so those regulations were outdated and were identified for repeal on that basis. The third set of regs, if you go to the next slide, please, were again pertaining to these prescriptive program requirements. So over the year before the Act's passage, the CECC met repeatedly to create this modern vision for the state's educator certification regime. These discussions led to the consensus that teacher prep programs should shift away from regulating strict coursework inputs to creating more flexible standards and guidance. Evaluating programs based on their ability to produce positive outcomes for candidates rather than the distributional requirements that they meet. Again, so this repeal is taking effect in July of 2026, so about 19 months from now. So to the extent that some of these regulations are going to be phased out, there is this kind of year and a half during which the certification board can take steps to ensure that there won't be a gap once the regulations do go out of effect, that there will be something to take their place. So we just flagged that in the last bullet on this slide as well. And then the fourth, if it is regulations that either contained obsolete terminology, references to the adult education endorsement or the BEST program that has evolved into TEAM, or regulations that dealt with things that no longer have much salience based on their time limitations. So provisions that pertain to special education employment prior to 1980, contracts for coaches in the specific timeframe of the 1998-99 school year, things like that that didn't seem to have a ton of relevance in today's state. So those are the general buckets for the certification regulations. And we can move on to the prep regs. So again, 3 general categories here. Regulations that no longer align with current law, regulations that should be updated to align with this board's responsibilities, and then regulations that again were covered by existing law prior to 2441's enactment. So this first set, regulations to be updated to align with existing policies. So many regulations were obviated based on the relationship that Connecticut has developed with CAPE in the intervening years. So Special Act 1622 required the Department of Education, the Office of Higher Ed, to enter into an agreement with the Council for the Accreditation of Educator Preparation, CAPE, to establish standards for EPPs leading to professional certification. So 24-41 repealed a number of regulations that established these standards prior to the formalization of the state's relationship with CAPE. So regulations that set forth standards for continuing program approval, regulations establishing standards related to EPP curriculum, evaluation, student admission, faculty qualifications, et cetera. And so the CEPCB, the CERT board, will now advise the legislature on whether to codify new requirements based on CAPE standards or simply allow CAPE's requirements to stand in their place based on the ongoing relationship that's in place between the state and the implementation law. Next slide, please. So before July 1st, 2026, the certification board will be required to kind of propose new initial program approval standards and to formalize continuing program approval criteria. This is again one of the requirements that is set forth in the law that was enacted this year. So prior to the regulations outlining program approval standards being phased out, the certification board will again look to propose these new standards for initial program approval, formalize the standards for continuing program approval that are already in place in line with CAPE's 7-year accreditation cycle and based on CAPE's final accreditation decisions. In line with this mandate, the CERT board may also need the authority to initiate site visits to ed prep programs. And again, there were regulations that spoke to a 5-year evaluation cycle. You'll probably want to align that with a 7-year cycle that CAPE uses to conduct site of ed prep. And finally, within the prep regulations, there were some that were enacted, subsumed by previously enacted statutes. So there is a statute that mandates that the Department of Education evaluate quality in detail annually. CAPE obviously has similar oversight processes requiring ed prep programs to maintain database performance assessment systems. And so because of the agreement between the State Department of Ed and CAPE that is mandated under Special Act 1622, Connecticut EPPs are already required to meet CAPE standards, which functionally gives those standards the force of law. So there were a few regulations in here that spoke to that kind of evaluation data reporting system that are captured by a combination of state law and CAPE. Finally, we just wanted to flag a few regulations that we didn't think necessarily fit neatly within the categorization framework that we've been discussing here, and which may require the certification board to give them another look to evaluate what, if anything, should take their place as they prepare for that July 1, 2026 phase out. So the first one that we're just flagging governs the review and revision of the Code of Professional Responsibility for Teachers. This had been the responsibility of Cactopus, I think, for is how you pronounce that.
That was a learning.
So again, this is being repealed. So theoretically, the prep board could say, it should still belong with Cactopus or reallocate that responsibility. Another one pertained to interim certificates. So the regulation being repealed covered, I think, both interim certificates at the initial and the provisional level. So as the provisional certificate is phased out, the question becomes whether interim certificates at the initial level will still need to be issued, and if so, under what conditions. And then finally, related to reissuance of the DSAP. So the initial criteria for the durational shortage area permit were not touched in the regulations. Those regs were left in place. There is a regulation that was identified for repeal that spoke to the reissuance of a DSAP. So potentially want to revisit those criteria as a certification board over the next 19 months. Okay, so that's the basic framework we think of how to consider the regulations that were enumerated in the statute for that July 1st, 2026 repeal. And to help you all kind of fulfill your responsibility before the January 31st reporting deadline to the legislature. So open for questions to all of us.
Are there any questions from the board? Fine, maybe in person. Are there any questions from the board?
Want to express my thanks because this was a lot. And it's very helpful, I think, to highlight the baseline ones. In the memo, my feeling was the first 7 pages was sort of self-evident. So when we got to the key relationship, something we need to look at.
Just want to confirm, reiterate that CPRL went through the hundreds of pages and years back of all of the regulations and the guidelines that have been set forth since the 1980s. And that's what came to fruition with the changes that have occurred in the past year or two and the continued recommendations. Like, you read it all, right?
Correct.
Okay. I think that's really important because sometimes you get the blue book or all the laws and things, and you're like, who in the world is really going to read all of this? And like your organization, besides the town office, your organization did that work and summarized it just really well. So thank you.
And just to be clear, this question was posed and this memo represents a review of the regulations pertaining to the preparation and certification pre-K through 12 teachers. It did not encompass regulations pertaining to administrators or other school support personnel.
That's really important. Yeah. And that the school administrators and support personnel, is that also in the purview of the work that we are going to be doing?
I don't think that the statute, so I'm not sure it's a good question for us to. With legal.
It'll be coming later.
It'll be coming later, so.
What's that?
So I can
So hold, yeah, we can take it out of that question.
Thank you.
We can address that with. Are there any other questions or comments for CPRO?
I would just add to what Rebecca was saying, the other piece that I think is important that is teams and the lawyers, so that I think our expertise that lending as well, if that's not our expertise.
That the CPRO group is
Yes.
lawyers, yes.
Like the second of thanks to CPRL and the team for putting this together and articulating so clearly about the work that was done and our work ahead. Thank you.
I have one more question. I'm sorry. Is the CPRO team in the work, if we have more things to ask of, we don't have an administrator yet, is there capacity on the CPRO team to continue to engage now in a way that you engaged a year ago with the last group? Can we call on you for more analysis or anything like that?
So we had actually asked about the contract and CPRO is not under a contract with the new board. They were invited to speak on their research today, but they're not currently contracted.
Do we need a contract to ask of you? To ask like for analysis or research?
This is nodding.
Well, no, we're happy. Thank you. And I realized that we didn't all introduce ourselves. I spent so much time talking about CPRL, but not us. But I'm Liz. Nice to meet all of you. I'm the executive director at CPRL and a researcher at Columbia. And Scheherazade, Ben, and Tong, who are also all here from the team. They're all lawyers. I'm a researcher. That's part of the interdisciplinary nature of the team. We are going to continue to be doing lots of educator workforce research in the state through our work with the Connecticut Innovation Cohort, and we are very, very happy to have as much of that as possible be useful to all of you, and are very happy since we're all working, I think, towards shared goals to the extent that we can be helpful in understanding anything that happened before or in speaking sort of more just about how the standards board operates within the body or within sort of like the administrative law framework of the state and things like that. Happy to have any of those conversations. And so we're happy to be an ongoing resource to the board and to all of our local systems and other partners throughout the state. And so we are sort of here to be helpful in whatever way may be useful. Of course, you know, if there were sort of like specific, I think the board itself is just being set up. And so the thing that's just giving, I could imagine a world. I don't know how the board is intending to operate. We'd be happy to talk about other ways of interacting with you all too. But for now, I would consider us a resource that's very active in your state around all things educator workforce. And we are here to be of service to you, given your role in trying to make sure that the educator workforce is professionalized and strong across the state. That's the goal that we're working toward as well.
It sounds like you're on call. For free. Well, somebody's at the moment, right? Not us. Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments? Thank you so much. It was a wonderful presentation. We appreciate and we'll be in touch should we have any other questions or concerns. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Dr. Chua? All right, next on our agenda is our draft bylaws discussion for items requiring action. I'm going to hand off to Kristen as she was the chair for the subcommittee of bylaws.
So hi, everyone. Kristen Besega, the chair of the bylaws subcommittee. So if you could find the sheet that has our draft number 2 of the bylaws. I want to say first that this draft passed unanimously out of committee. Then afterwards, items in red were suggestions either from the Commissioner of Education, other people within the Department of Education that Chloe has talked to. One was a sentence that didn't have a verb, so we want to fix that. And I think there was one part there we wanted to make the law as part of the bylaws. So everything in black has already been reviewed by the bylaws committee where it passed unanimously. And to give a little background of how we put this document together, I started with the State Board of Education's bylaws. We replaced a lot of the wording pertaining to the State Board of Education's purview with the wording from Public Act number 24-41, which gives our board authority. So you'll notice that under, under the organization of the board, the appointment of board members, all of that language follows directly from the Public Act. So is there anything in Article either 1 or the appointment of board members that anyone would like me to review in more detail?
Assuming in section 3 to say.
I mean, we can do this pretty loosely if you'd like, or I can say the chair recognizes there.
Assuming in section 3, Article 1, section 3, the vote of 11 members, that's
2/3 of 16, rounded up from 10.67, rounded up to 11 whole people.
total of 16.
We're 16. So then we come to our first edit. This one was a suggestion from, I believe, the Commissioner of Education, because we didn't have any language in the bylaws without this term, saying the length of our terms and how vacancies are appointed. So the item in red, members of the board serve 3-year terms, that's from the Public Act, and then vacancies shall be filled by the appointing authority not later than 10 days following such a vacancy. So if for some reason I couldn't continue the work, CEA as my appointing authority would appoint someone else within 10 days. On section 3, where it lists all of the actions of the administrator, the duties of our administrator when they're someday hired. We had talked about in the committee, not including bylaws as part of the duties of the administrator. But since the administrator is going to be the person who shows continuity, when our terms are all ended, the administrator will hopefully still be here to be our secretary, storing documents, storing information. They'll also be storing the bylaws, and if the bylaws need to be amended at some point in the future, that administrator should probably be supporting the board in that duty. So red was added for that reason. Is there anything so far that you'd like more information or questions on? Patrice.
Hi, how are you? This is
Hi,
Jennifer.
and I
Hi,
Oh, I
apologize.
I think there's a confusion. I think two hands were up. We're gonna go with Patrice first and then we'll go to
Okay.
Jen.
Sure.
Thanks so much, and I do apologize. I am literally in 2 meetings virtually simultaneously. My only question was in Article 3, Section 9, providing that a member may request that their remarks be made part of the minutes. I have some concern that that becomes a slippery slope. If one member feels the need to do that, it may prompt every member to feel that their comments need to be included. Certainly people could submit a written statement just as if they would during public participation, but I'm not sure that we should open the door to necessarily including that in the minutes.
We can skip up to that section and look ahead if you'd like. It is Article 3, Section 9 minutes.
We want to go to Jen just in case there was something she wanted to discuss in the current part that we're reviewing. So Jen, go ahead.
Hi. Regarding the administrator, back on section 3, number 6, I wanted to clarify a little more around that. Am I understanding that the suggestion here is that the person who eventually becomes the administrator is also on the team, or just like how would that person be part of supporting the
administrator-
bylaws without being on the team?
Right. So the administrator will be a State Department of Education employee. They won't be an elected or appointed member of this board, but they could definitely help us with amending the bylaws, given that they're supposed to have a legal background and legal expertise. During our bylaws meeting, we had other people to help advise and answer legal questions. So where it says that this administrator would provide support to establish and amend the board bylaws, it would not be as a voting member. They wouldn't get to have the ultimate approval authority, but they'd be able to answer any questions that we might have as a board onto whether our bylaws are in conflict with other laws and be able to provide that support to us.
Oh, okay. So that person would have a law background?
I believe that's one of the things they had put for the hiring of the administrator. Oh, so another thing
Thanks.
was you're welcome. When we had started writing the bylaws, we started with the State Board of Education bylaws, changed the things that are applicable using the Public Act, but we also included the State Department of Education's posting for their job posting for this administrator position. So we do have an idea of what items the state intends this administrator to do. So the items in that category 1 through 9 were all either from the Public Act or from the posting of that open position.
Okay, so it's also a new hire, a new position within the State Department of Ed.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry.
So just to follow along with that line of thinking, so the number 9, collaboratively work with liaison to the State Board of Education, did that come right from the job description?
I forget which ones come from where, but I believe that one was from the job description.
I just wonder if that
clear that, so the administrator for this board will be our liaison with the State Board of Education? Is that how the role was understood?
That was my understanding, but Chloe, I don't know if you wanted to chime in on this one. So that bullet point is from the job posting. I think the idea is that because this board is supposed to work parallel with the State Board of Ed, that we're trying to make the department in posting this position is trying to ensure that that is reflective. So working collaboratively, essentially like most of the duties associated with being the administrator and liaison for the State Board of Education, this administrator will do for the certification board. The job description does, it's the first bullet point, I think, in the it just asks if you have like a political science or legal degree. And that would be preferred. So it's not a requirement for this person, but it would be helpful, especially because it has to do with regulations and things like that. It would be helpful if the administrator had a background in it. Is that helpful?
Yes, thank you.
Third question, recognizes Margaret. Section 1, are we staying silent on how many reappointments the board members can have? Reconfirm.
So the law doesn't specify if there's a limit to reappointments. So we didn't discuss it as a bylaws subcommittee.
As long as the authority decides that that person, at any time the authority could change.
There's a vacancy, yes, I think.
There's not a vacancy and the authority wishes to remove the person, replace them.
I'm not sure because the law gives these bodies the authority to make the appointments. I'm not sure if the law is silent on whether the, AFT could take an appointment away or if Teacher of the Year Council could take an appointment away. That wasn't specified in the law. So I'm not sure if the bylaws, it would make sense to address that.
Something to definitely, when the lawyers come though, to ask them to say, yeah, even if we put it in our bylaws, does the authority still, does that override it or not? You have experience with that, like, do you?
I have an experience with a national board where someone needed to be removed. And the authority replaced them with someone else. It was in the bylaws. But I just wondered if you were silent on it, if it was something purposefully silent on or to.
Can we write that down as a question for the people to hear them? The authority to replace within the 3-year term. And read it afterwards. Right. And then, go ahead.
Oh, Jared, something tiny, but just for consistency's sake, we probably want to capitalize bylaws in the red.
Is there any other questions during the first 3 sections? Right. We're moving on to section 4, which is that where Patrice was asking questions about?
I think we're right about there. So am I standing? I think we're up to Article 3 board procedures. So under board procedures, one of the questions that the bylaws subcommittee had was under section 3, organizational meeting of the board. And for us, for our term, this would have been the meeting we had last month. It was the first regular meeting of a newly appointed board. And because we don't have an administrator right now, and we didn't have one last month, the administrator was not conducting an organizational meeting. But Chloe, as our support person, and the 2 lawyers from the state, they conducted this organizational meeting to help elect the chairperson, vice chairperson, and review the bylaws at that meeting. And the date we came up with as a committee was September 1st, so that it would be close to the school year. But on the law in the Public Act, it says our appointments would be by August 1st. So our terms run August 1st to July 30th. But the nice thing about this edit by saying this meeting will be on or after August 1st, is the board could choose to have that meeting later and it would still meet the requirements of the bylaws, but also be aware of the fact that many educators are, busy doing other jobs in the summer. If you're professors, you might be doing other work towards your research. So the suggestion for the August 1st date is to help it better match the date within the Public Act. All right, so then if we continue farther up at public participation, executive session, and then we had a question from section 9, the minutes. So the question was, do we want this to stand in the bylaws? This is something that the bylaws committee didn't discuss in any sort of depth. So be happy to take questions or discuss this right now with everybody. The statement says, a member may request that his or her remarks be made part of the minutes and shall state same as briefly as possible.
Discussion or thought on that section 9 minutes? Patrice had already spoken to that, right, Patrice?
Yeah, and it's just that given my experience with local boards, if you start down this route, you could end up with minutes that are volumes, which is not the legal purpose of minutes.
May I ask where the idea of this came from? Is there maybe if I could hear the reason for this addition might help me to understand better?
So in this case, it wasn't as much of an addition as adoption of language from the State Board of Education's bylaws. So the State Board of Education has this line word for word in their bylaws. So it wasn't as much as we wanted affirmatively to have this, as much as, we're looking at the same structure and format as the State Board of Education. So would be happy to consider any suggestions or changes.
I would, Patrice, I hadn't heard that analysis or that thought process, and it really resonates with me, and that if somebody wanted additional insight into, that they could easily put it into public comment, and then it would be part of public. So what you've shared is, I would support that in changing.
The other thing that I'm wondering about with this idea is, so say we're having a discussion and there's a difference of opinion and one person says, I want my comments put into the minutes. My opinion gets put into the minutes. The other person decides, I don't want my comments put into the minutes. I think someone who then chooses to read the minutes, and I don't know how often that happens, it could skew the way people interpret how the meeting went.
Dr. Rowe.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. So I think this is a really interesting conversation, and it would be, I think that we have to add the idea and the relevance that this is it's an open session. It's also recorded, video recorded. So any public comment is already included in the record in the recorded session. So if we, and I hear what you're saying, Patrice, absolutely, if I may call you Patrice, but at the same time, the public record in the minutes, if we do not include that portion of it, it wouldn't be congruent with the video recording. I'm just putting that out there because now at what point, and we don't have a legal representation here, but is now the recorded session going to supersede recorded minutes? I mean, in some respect, are the minutes going to be antiquated because there's always something that's missed when you record something, or something that might be different. So I hear you, Patrice, that it may not be at this point, so, but there would still be a lack of congruence if we do not include public comment. Just something to think about.
I'm looking over the current minutes from our last meeting, and it doesn't go into such detail that it records word for word participants' participation on the board or public. So I think that wouldn't happen anyways. So the only real option of having it aligned or not aligned or an alternative is the video recording that people would have to refer to, because our current note-taking system doesn't align with having that detailed recording of these meetings.
I'd like to make a suggestion to be considered that we take out the second sentence and instead at the very end, add something to the effect that the entire meeting is recorded and can be accessed via site.
I just want to make sure clarifying for Robert's rules here, because these are kind of not adopted bylaws, or do we still go through the full process of amending the bylaws and then voting on the amendment, or?
I should have just said I agree with you.
I just wasn't sure, so I wanted to know, I'm not sure how that would work.
I think since the bylaws have not yet been accepted, we don't have to go accept them and then do a 2/3 vote after. I think that if you make a motion to amend here with a second, and we have a discussion, then when we move to adopt, we can say, you know, I move to adopt as amended instead of adopting then amend.
So I think I heard from the table then that we had an amendment, right, to strike sentence 2 and replace with a note at the end to refer to the video.
Sure.
For additional information.
Right. We can say something about meeting minutes of the committee shall be made available to all members of the board. In addition, a virtual recording of every meeting will be made available to members of the whoever wants.
We had a second for that. All right, so we are open for discussion. Any discussion on that?
This is Ro. Can you just repeat that, what you just said?
Sure, we were going to strike. Do you want to go ahead and repeat the amendment? Go ahead.
Sure, we were going to strike the second sentence. So this section would read, the actions taken by the board shall be recorded in its minutes. The minutes, along with the printed agenda and its backup materials, shall constitute the official record of the board. Minutes of committee meetings shall be made available to all members of the board. Virtual recording of every meeting is also available to the public.
Okay, thank you.
Is there any further discussion?
Just clarifying, that's section 8. No, section 9. Section 9, just removing the second sentence. All other words stay there, just removing the second sentence.
And
Okay,
adding the
thank
sentence at the end.
Thank you.
Yes.
And that second sentence actually be the minutes along with the agenda, its backup materials and the recordings will constitute the official record of the meeting.
It sounds like an amendment 2. Are you proposing an amendment to the third line? We currently have one amendment though, and I think we have to. Yeah, so do we want to, would you like to adjust your amendment to remove the additional line at the end?
Sure. I feel like we need to have a reference added to where people can find these things. Would it be the state board? Yes. Okay, so then I can try to amend the minutes along with the printed agenda, comma, backup materials, comma, and virtual recording of each meeting shall constitute the official record of the board and can be accessed via the Board of Education website. Link to the Connecticut State Certification Council.
Still agree with that? Did you second that? Does that seem more appropriate? Is there any questions or concerns or ideas for adjustment?
Okay, seeing none, we'll put this to a vote. All those in favor of the amendment to remove line 2 and then add into line 3 and recording, as well as the last line, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Raise your hand.
Aye.
What we're going to do.
9. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Right.
So I've got that written down, and when I make version 3, draft 3 of this, then I'll make sure that is included. Under Article 4, functions of the board, this originally didn't have sections, but the Commissioner of Education made a suggestion to include section 2. And so section 1, reports and timelines, was enumerated. That's the first change in red. Under functions of the board, these 6 functions were taken from the Public Act, but the second sentence, the one that's by July 1st, 25, that didn't have a connecting word there. So the word regarding was added to make that a sentence that made sense. For number 5, when we originally discussed this as a subcommittee, we must have missed the 5th function of the board. So it was suggested we include this function of the board as well under number 5. So also function number 6 was renumbered. And finally, section 2, the one that was the suggestion from the commissioner, this is the exact language from Public Act 2441, where it relates the State Board of Education and our board, and clarifies this kind of joint co-equal role that we have. Which brings us to the end. So any questions, comments, revisions?
Or did I miss, did this part came out of?
Yes.
Section 2, you mean.
So section 2, exactly from the legislation.
Is there any question or discussion about those sections reviewed? Anna, did you have your hand raised?
Yes, 2 quick questions that aren't specific to the language as much as just the process. One for meeting minutes. Is there an open, I know that the administrator would be the person taking the minutes, but are we open to an AI tool for that purpose? Because I know there's a lot of great resources in that space, and I don't have a preference. I'm just putting it out there as a question to discuss. And then I'm thinking about the procedural pieces of putting the documents together that need to be submitted by all the deadlines. Having been on the Department of Education side of doing that work, it's a big lift just to package the write the documents, package the documents, do the cover letter. Absent that person being in place, especially since there's a deadline in January, I'm just kind of curious what our backup plan is for that, and also what role the standards board has in finally reviewing the final version of the documents that would be ultimately submitted to meet our deadlines.
So that was several questions. I think I can only answer one of them, because the bylaws are specifically about this board. I guess if the administrator wanted to use an AI for the taking of the minutes, I guess that would be their professional choice. I don't think us as a board can dictate what they do in that role. I'm not super sure. So maybe it just makes sense to leave it silent and the state restrictions will hold. And then the other questions about what to do if we don't have an administrator in place to help us do this work. Like, you are answered by the person who's currently acting as our administrator.
For the time being, I will be acting as administrator until somebody is fired.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Does that answer all the questions, Shannon?
Yeah, I think it'll play out as we're going, but I think when there's that final submission, I just remember when I had to do one of them on behalf of a board, that there was a process articulated in advance on who reviewed the final documents before I hit send on the email to the General Assembly. And just, I don't know that we need to pin that down in the bylaws, but I think it's something that would be good to talk about as a board, that we know who's going to have final eyes on whatever gets ultimately submitted to meet our deadlines.
That be tabled for another time as we get deeper.
Good question.
SDE. Yes. That's normally how we.
So we're just trying to bridge how we get from the writer here to.
Include within, I think what I'm understanding, within these board is going to be the last set of eyes, right?
Fair. That's to prove that correct.
I would say, let's wrap up the bylaws, but we should, and then like, can we come back to this conversation?
Yes.
But like, can we close this out? Because these are really important too, but yeah, they wouldn't be in the bylaw.
So are we also the current bylaws? I just have one more question. Sure, go ahead. Section 2, very last paragraph. It elaborates on State Board of Education shall approve or reject any such standard, well, not later than 60 days. If such standard or proposal is approved, and that it several times it mentions if such standard is approved, but is there language that needs to go in there if standard is rejected? Or do we just not think that's ever going to happen? I'm just wondering, it's laid out with approval, but not with what do we do if they say, oh, we don't like this?
So my thinking is inclusion exclusion. If they specifically included the language that it'll be implemented if approved, then the converse, they didn't include saying what would be done if not approved, then I would assume it would not be implemented.
It was, I guess I was wondering if there was time for revision then, or does that just start the clock in 60 days?
Sure, so everything in red here was the suggestion of the Commissioner of Education based on a public act. So my take is that if the public act was unclear and it didn't specify, that the converse would be that if it not approved, then it won't be implemented and it doesn't give any other additional timelines after. But I don't think that precludes us from, let's say, they don't approve something after 60 days, we make edits and resubmit it to them. It doesn't preclude us from doing that.
I think that was the intent. Here was to have that kind of back and forth. Hopefully coming to some kind.
And not having to restart the clock. And that doesn't create the efficiencies and flexibilities that we had talked so much about. So is there a motion to add language to reflect that? What should the language be?
Always in favor of less.
Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like what you shared, it sounds like it's more like it's you infer if there's nothing about the standard proposal being rejected, then there's this inference that something will happen, and maybe it just is inferred versus explicitly stated.
Yeah, we are right, because it's funny, they probably say it 3 times in these paragraphs, saying that if approved, it'll be implemented, so then they neglected to put the opposite of that, but that will read as its intention.
Do we have a motion
Was there
to?
questions specifically about I know we were jotting down questions for when legal came. Is there anything pertaining to the bylaws? The questions club.
What were the questions that we currently have?
They're here just to be.
Yeah. The first was from Dr. Good. I just jotted it down, so if you need to elaborate, please do. Will the certification board be pertaining to administrative or professional staff? That makes sense.
Yeah, so the question for CPRL had been.
They reviewed all teacher.
Right, when asked, the extent of the review, David said that, so it says the memo represents a review of the regulations pertaining to the preparation certification pre-K through 12 teachers. It does not encompass regulations pertaining to administrators or other school support personnel, which I don't think that the legislation spoke to.
So the question, I think, is the way I read it, it just refers to all certification rules, inclusive of administrators and special services staff and things like that. But if you're certified, I think it's really about jurisdiction along as articulated in the bylaws.
Wait, can you, like, so any certified, any type of certified employee is within a public school setting?
Anybody who has a state board, right, issued certification, a license. That's. Yes. Yeah.
Coaching purposes.
Right, that's,
This is a lot bigger than.
yeah.
Yeah. I would say so, yeah.
That was the indication last year. I don't know, Rebecca, agree, but I think a lot of the discussion was on the actual teaching. Yeah, but the idea was that we were updating the regulations. I think the request to people go back and look at the other ones in the same way we look at the teacher ones would be a first step in that direction, because otherwise it's just huge undertaking that it's.
Just for reference, this is just for everybody's reference. So if you look at section 11, Public Act 2441, subsection A. So this board, the certification, the Educator Preparation and Certification Board and the State Board shall each have authority to develop standards and proposals for regulations and legislation, usually key part, relating to educator preparation and certification. Certification is very broad. I don't think it's really limited at all. I think it's just state board issued certification.
So I would say, how would does this affect our bylaws currently? That question. Right.
Yeah, I don't think so, but I do think it affects very largely the relationship with state, because state doesn't always approve standards wise. Talking, but you know what I mean? Like,
Can we table that conversation to get through the bylaws and have direct conversation or questions related to the bylaws, get past those, and then we can revisit that at the end of that motion? Make sense?
Question about bylaws, if I may. But could we leverage the bylaws to focus on a certain area for year 1, since this is a 3-year term? So in the last section, number 1, a recommendation that could fit in the bylaws is that we focus on the shortage areas to really build the pipeline, which I think is why we're all here initially around educators, working directly in schools with students, service models, special education, all of the areas of need. And in year 2 and 3, address the other areas.
I think we have a mandate by the statute on what we are supposed to do, and I'm worried about kind of putting limitations or timelines. I think that can be addressed when we are speaking to the state and having those conversations about what we have done so far and what the intention of the group is moving forward. And kind of provide a loose timeline of what that might look like, especially once we're actually in the work and we have an administrator in place that can assist us with it. So I'm not sure how the rest, it's open to discussion, but I'm not sure that we need to codify that into bylaws because then we might have to amend it later on if we get through those things within a certain period of time and we be revisiting the bylaws. Is there any other discussion on that?
I would agree with you, Jennifer. I think bylaws are structural and they're not necessarily. Based.
I understand, just as I wasn't part of the certification group last year, the group last year that worked for a year, talk about administrators and coaches and all of the other certifications, adult education, so forth and so on. No, so we don't have any background knowledge on that as of yet.
So for the purpose of the bylaws, though, that wouldn't be something that we would include at this time as amended. Are there any other questions on that list that might reflect or be relevant to the bylaws before we place the vote?
One was from Margaret. Does this board have the authority to replace individuals in the future?
So on section,
It was Article 2, this is Section 1. It was talking about vacancies shall be filled by the appointing authority not later than 10 days following such a vacancy. And the question that we had for the legal team, for the lawyers, is that, you know, does either the Public Act or some other authority give one of these groups the right to revoke an appointment midterm? If someone had to be.
Statute certainly, or the Public Act certainly doesn't say that.
Right.
That would be a pretty extraordinary step, I would think, to replace a member. I mean, that's not, I think it's contemplated that they have 3-year terms. That's sort of a more complicated question. I think we have to think about it. I wouldn't feel comfortable answering that on the spot, but that typically doesn't come up.
Yeah, I would think if anything, replacements of certain individuals, those circumstances would have to be put into the bylaws, but it's not pursuant to the Public Act. And yeah, then now we're getting into, you know, advice about how you would go about doing that. So.
I'm on another board and I'm trying to think of the vacancy, like, revoking or whatever. There is something about attendance. Like if someone just doesn't show up 4 times in a row or something, that's reason to raise it, but that's the only thing I can.
It was purely that the representative failed accurately represents their authority. I don't know that needs to be.
I don't.
Hard to discern.
We use the state board, yeah, I mean, we use the state board bylaws as a model. The state board bylaws won't address it. It seems to me that's an extraordinary.
Yeah, that's true. It also, if we look at the language from the Public Act saying the board shall, this is section, for reference, this is section 10. The board shall consist of, so it must consist of the following members. And I mean, it addresses, for example, 2 people appointed by the Connecticut Education Association. So it's really, I mean, I suppose you could have a revocation process here, but then it would just have to be, let's say it was somebody from CEA or any of these entities, Teacher of the Year Council, then they would be the ones making the appointment. So.
And that's how it would go for the state board of ed. if somebody is revoked, it's not done by the state board, it's done by.
No, it's not done by the state board.
The commissioner's office.
You're talking about for a member of,
If somebody, right, if somebody on the state board,
yeah, there's a whole separate
Right.
statutory process.
it's not it's not within the state board. When that happens. There's
No,
unique
no,
cases.
that's codified in statute.
Yeah, no, I was just, so are we contemplating that, let's just take an example, group A, we'll call it.
Yeah, we don't.
So if group A wants to change their person, is that what we're talking about, or
They're in the,
are
they're
you saying
three-year
that this
term.
board
I think.
wants to expel someone?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, there's,
Expulsion.
no.
Oh, I thought it was the first.
Thought it was the first.
Yeah, like group A wants to
Group A
switch out
wants- we don't like
somebody.
the
We don't want you on there. We want to switch somebody out, but they're in the middle of their 3 years. Can group A do that?
I think group A would have to think about that. I don't know. I honestly don't think that is a productive use of the time, in my view. I mean,
Don't either.
I don't know why we're,
Right, is there any further discussion on that then, or any amendments that need to be proposed? Are we good? Okay. All right, is there any further or were there any other questions?
One more question. About the date. For first.
Versus August 1st date?
Correct.
Oh, I didn't know if that was an actual question because I took it from the law.
I just wrote it down, so I.
But- In any case, it would be under Article 3. Section 3. The first regular meeting on or after August 1st, I had taken the August 1st date from the Public Act based on when the appointments needed to be made by. Is there anything from your perspective saying why it should or shouldn't be this date?
Public Act just says all initial appointments shall be made not later than August 1st, 2024.
So in my reading, I took that to mean that our terms run from August 1st, then 3 years to July 31st.
Yes. One more thought, should we put in anything about how we can access work with the committee virtually or personally? I think we talked about that last time, but I'm not sure if it should be in the bylaws that this committee is available through two methods.
I don't know that that needs to be delineated under the procedures because we voted on it in the last meeting. And I don't think there's anything else in the bylaws as written that specifies person, virtual, or hybrid.
I'll also add that we're required to post everything on the website as well, so they're publicly available at the same time as, I will share them, but they will be available, like the draft minutes are up there, the agenda's up there. The only thing that's not is the SEBRO presentation, okay? Because I received it this morning, so I didn't have time to request it until here, but everything else is there. The meetings are not live. It's being streamed on YouTube, because right now it's live, okay, and then will be uploaded and it's embedded on the website. So.
Any further discussion on the bylaw? I have a motion, for the bylaw. We pass the bylaws as amended.
Yes. Kristen Mistega, I would move to approve the bylaws as amended.
Good, I'll second. Any discussion?
All in favor, raise your hand. Any, all in favor? Not in favor? I'm at a loss for words right now. Raise your hand now. Any abstentions? Yes.
A point of personal privilege. I'd like to thank everyone who was on the bylaws subcommittee with me for spending your extra 2 hours to help come up with this document and read through all the little details. I really appreciated everyone's work and commitment. Thank you very much.
Thank
For
you.
your work, you.
Because they've done a lot of the work prior to the meeting, so it made that meeting move very smoothly, very quickly, with relatively good time. So we should work that can be done for that. Before we move into our other discussion, an opportunity for public participation, I just want to kind of follow the agenda as it is. Then we also be discussions as we still have. So is there anybody listed for public participation currently? On the list? No one? I guess we're going to move into just having, it's not on the agenda, but any other discussion around the questions that were posed earlier? Oh, sorry.
I'm just saying thank you.
Oh, thank you, sorry. Getting a lot of blinking. So there was the question on the table that we wanted to go back to.
About the staff that we wanted to go back to? Or
Dr. Michelle, which one, what was the question that we wanted to go back to? Was
When we were talking about it, including as part of our role to use regulatory language for staff, for administrators, or teaching, you know, that the whole thing that the regs covered. Well, we didn't talk about it a lot last year. The role of this group was to review and update the regulations, and I think that more broadly includes that. The much of what CPRL has done, and a lot of the references are to the standards that CAPE sets standards, those standards by which we need to look at in order to have regulations that are in conjunction with the standards. But CAPE doesn't cover all of that. So we can't just use CAPE standards because CAPE standards only look at initial licensure and certification. They don't look at certification and licensure of, let's say, second license, or there's a number of things where that would provide a hole in standard use because it doesn't exist. One of the things I was going to recommend to everyone is to go on the CAPE site, there's a summary of the 6 standards and what they do. I think it's really important for this group to understand that contextually. You know, I'm from an EPP, so I know them, education preparation program. A lot of people don't know what those accrediting standards are, but those are what we look to license and certify people. But it doesn't cover everything. And even some of the CPRL suggestions, which we'll get into at some point, it's not always covered by CAPE, or there was like a mismatch there. So you really need to understand what CAPE does and doesn't do in order to be able to do that. But CAPE is the body that credits us for licensure in this state. So
Just a, this is a, you'll have to forgive my ignorance, but CAPE is just institutions, right? It's just for higher ed institution.
No, it's approving educator preparations, like a higher ed would be like your middle states would be like an example of just an institution of higher education. This is very specific to educator preparation.
That's what I mean.
any educator preparation program that provides for recommendations for licensure and certification.
Yeah.
Initial. Cert. So that's different than.
So when you say all employees.
Oh, yeah, no, this.
State.
Yes.
All that, I'm looking at you, Mel.
Yeah, the admin level.
Under yours. Like the certified, like certifications, all professional certifications, under the state board, that goes into.
This board's charge
Administrator.
is huge. It really, it's all of.
I guess I just want the list. I know
Yeah.
huge, and who else is on that? Like that's, so we're looking at the paraprofessionals, we're looking at our admin, we're looking at.
Well, paraprofessionals, they're not.
So it's not certified.
Okay, that's not the-
Biologists,
Social workers,
Coaches.
SLPs.
communities,
Our OTs and PTs are not certified, right?
Not by.
Well, it
Not
can
by
be.
the state,
Certified
not by the state.
Individual holds a certification, but the question is, is there certification required to?
I don't think it's under the regulations as they stand now. See, that's why I said CPRO perhaps added for the other piece. Look and say, okay, these are the areas you gotta look at. These are the regulations that are prompted now or no,
So-
or,
I would say as our acting admin, would you be able to get a list of all the certifications? Possibly for the next meeting. I think the focus though right now for this initial deadline is what's already been done by CPRO. And then maybe contacting them and asking them what the process is and asking them to help us evaluate the other ones as well. We do have a pretty lengthy document of some of the work that they've done, which I think helps to meet the requirements for the first deadline that we have here in the statute of identifying absolute and conflicting provisions. And ability to work on things like minimum content knowledge assessments and possible alternatives to approaches to minimum content knowledge for that first deadline. But I think it goes a long way in helping us on A of that act. So you can certainly do that, Chloe. Okay, and then it looks like
So we recommend that version of the certification office here, as we were through that list, we can ask them the questions that they were gonna need to, just kind of how things here today.
As a resource to kind of bounce
Yeah.
questions off of as the experts in the room on certification. That'd be great. Patrice, did you see that your hand is raised? We'll go over the book earlier.
She's muted.
Can't hear you if you're trying to talk. She did say she was on two virtual meetings
So maybe she
simultaneously,
left
so
this
she
hand.
might, so we'll come back to that. So it sounds like right now we have a lot to review here for the first part of it, and then we start talking about things like minimum content knowledge assessments and approaches to minimum content in order to kind of like meet that deadline. And my understanding is it's not uncommon for deadlines to be pushed, and we present what we have and kind of, speak to moving the rest on to a later date, given the amount of time that we have to do this work. She bounced off of the call, maybe she's having trouble.
I think she also said she was.
Right, so I guess it's, what are our next steps? Were there any more questions on that one? Okay.
Unless there are other.
What would be our next step as the board in terms of meeting the requirements for the first deadline? Do we go through the CPRO document now, section by section, and bring everybody up to speed?
Then we could just reiterate exactly what it is that we think they will by annual.
So it says review reporting on educator preparation and certification, content knowledge, Public Act 2441, Section 13. A, identify absolutely conflicting provisions. B, minimum content knowledge assessment, and 3, possible alternative approaches to minimum content knowledge, as I read it correctly. Is that correct? Yeah.
I think it would be helpful to go through each one. There's recommendations that are made. These are just those, so if we talk about, well, what do we think? Because sure, this will be the group that puts it forward.
Is everybody in agreement to start that conversation now and start going through the CPRO document, not their PowerPoint document? It's this one. The summary, yes. Memo. The memo. Yes. If everybody had a chance to already read over the overview as well as the regulation on page 1. Does anyone need time to do that at this time? So my understanding is table 1 on page 2 the certification regulations were repealed on account of having been superseded or made obsolete by public act. So if you want to kind of go through, just go through the first one, because there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sections to that it discusses. So the first one is reasons for repeal. Regulations address provisional certification which were eliminated in public act.
I think most of this page is the removal of the provisional, which then makes it obsolete. So it's pretty,
That's been done.
self-evident.
We're all set there then. Is there any discussion on it? We know that at the last meeting, I think it was AFT Jenny that you had brought up how the certification for 4 through 12 was concerning. I think they discussed. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Okay.
So, I just let them know if something else comes up.
Yeah.
If they're gonna send.
Yeah.
Just tell me.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. So they are readily available to us in the next hour and a half or so. Thank you. Jenny, talk about to that or?
Yeah, I guess my concerns about that were twofold. One, what do our college prep programs look like if we are widening the certification bands? And then not having the content knowledge to teach for those who currently have a lesser band of certification. If my job was eliminated and now I am certified to teach 5th or 6th grade, but I'm only, up until this point, I've only been certified to 3rd grade and I haven't gone back to school, being put in a grade that I have no knowledge of how to teach. So it was kind of like a both and concern with the widening of the bands.
When April was here, I think the terminology that they had used was that it was widened for 4 through 12. Should the younger those grades be structured in such a way that content specific would, if you were in a 4th grade and you were only teaching social studies, is what I understood it to be. That
was part of the conversation. And is that in the purview of us to make the policy on like how a school then determines like that would be like, right? Like we wouldn't add that to this policy, or could we?
So for instance, Cromwell for their elementary school has a science specific teacher for grade 4. She sees all the grade 4 students as a specialist, but her background is in science. So my understanding is the widening of certification bands would take someone who's certified general science and be able to have them teach in an elementary school as a science teacher. And I think at the last meeting, I had the same concerns as Jenny, but one of the things to point out is that this regulation has already gone into effect. That was part of the Public Act, so it is already law. And we could, as a board, choose to write a memo, guidance, something in opposition to it, but that is already in effect. So as a result, is in conflict with the previous laws, previous regulation. So that's why it's on that list.
Well, it's a law, so could we, and I don't say I want to do this, I'm just thinking about what I learned today. There's law, regulation, and guidance. And so we could write, so inclined to write either forward a new regulation or guidance.
And ideally, well, there's so much guidance wrapped up in regulations right now, it wrapped up in laws, that it makes it very slow and complicated for aspiring teachers or current teachers or EPTs to be able to make movement. And the reasoning for this group was to move things more into guidelines, which would be us, and less into law and regulation, so that there could be more flexibility in that. So the more we put in law, the more we put in regulation, we'll be repeating, the slower it will be, and we'll be repeating some of the things that have occurred that we've been doing since the.
So we're making,
Certification and licensure, people coming into the profession. As it's sort of reflecting on people who are already there, who are getting moved around. That's not really the purview of what's do here.
Yeah.
So we have to be careful about that. I have feelings about it too, clearly as a dean, like what is this gonna do to my curriculum and preparation, that kind of thing. But I can't tell the schools what to do with an already certified teacher who now has a broader certification simply because the law changed. That is the case. That's what happened. I think right now our goal is, understanding it right, is what content, how do we want to define what content is for initial certification in this wider band? And, right? And how are we going to show that
right, I think making note that there is some concern in there that might lead to some regulation or guidance later on is an appropriate thing for us to say, and I made note of it. But if we want to move to the next one then, since this is statute and it's more of, we have to just align statute to regulation at this point on that specific one, we can move to the next. Right, so regulation no longer valid based on the codification of two-tier licensure. I think most people were in agreement when it was under the council and it became law.
Sorry, Jennifer, where are you?
I'm sorry, I'm in the second, I'm on page 2, but the second thought.
reason to repeal?
Well, yes, reasons to repeal. So to kind of build background there, it was just too many redundancies and we're trying to streamline the process. So that's why we'd gotten rid of the provisional, I believe it was. Regulation that conflicts with the change in endorsement breadth codified into law. So that was that 4 to 12, which we just talked about there.
And can I clarify? So is elementary now pre-K to 6?
Yes.
That's interesting to think about somebody that.
Oh my God.
I mean, that was a lot of the work last year, and then Beth like shared a lot around expanding to pre-K. And like that, it took the support of the entire council, including our representatives for ECE around what that meant and that expansion. And we talked a lot about CAPE and what that would mean for educator preparation to expand past K and go into pre-K as well to prepare aspiring teachers. So it might be worth having her speak to some of that. I don't know, or at least that last year's experience.
You say Beth.
Oh, I'm sorry, Beth. Bye. I apologize.
But in terms of what exists right now, it just, those particular pieces of the legislation go away because they no longer make any sense. So part of what we need to do for January is basically give them this and say these things.
Right, I would imagine it would be a more formal document in terms of like, these are the regulations, these are the things that are being stricken out because of these different acts in obsolete. Much like when we remove legislation and we have to amend it and things, so I think it would be very similar.
So whether or not we agree with it, it's a whole nother issue, but.
Right, but it's helpful to build a little bit of consensus and understanding because half of the board was not on the committee last year, and it allows a little bit of conversation around what the reasoning was as we kind of go through, especially because it was such a new piece of legislation. All right, so then repealed sections, regulation, so all of page 4 really is all repealed based on statute. Application procedures, documentation of materials, assessment requirements and exemptions. Right. Page 5. Take a moment to review it and see if there's any questions on page 5 about the material and reviewing about the accessibility based on work last year.
So page 5, are those also repealed?
So page 5 is duplicate or overridden regulations. It's listed on page 3 at the bottom of the next table. So starting on page 4 and onto page 5 and page 6. And part of page 7 are all the duplicate and overridden regulations. So the first one is repeal section, the section name, and then the citation to policy that makes the regulation redundant or obsolete in chapter.
I have a question on the very last one at the bottom of page 4. So they are mentioning a repealed section. So this one's saying that this regulation establishes certification as a prerequisite to employment. And this regulation requires Board of Education to supervise and evaluate teachers. So the new written law establishes certification and requires Boards of Ed to supervise and evaluate teachers. And therefore 10-145D is repealed. Is that what I'm reading right?
And then it goes on to talk about that the requirement addressed in section 10-145. Requiring 10-150.
That definitely makes sense, that that certification is a requirement to employment and that Boards of Education supervise and evaluate teachers. I was just surprised that that was redundant or obsolete compared to something else. So that's my only question. I think Shannon has.
Yeah.
Shannon,
I
go
can
ahead.
go-
Sorry.
So I think this section is just sort of a cleanup of things that have happened. Like that change isn't because of the recent law. It's actually the 10-151B was from 2012 and just never got reconciled. So I think this section is sort of a cleanup crew of all things in statute that kind of may actually have contradicted regs as they already were, but definitely now are obsolete because of what was just, not ever cleaned up or because it's been changed now because of the new law. So it's a mix of things, but why it's now obsolete may not have anything to do with the 2024 statute, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Okay, this is where I'm getting confused. And so if it's in the column that says redundant or obsolete, does that mean that's being removed or that's where it's been rewritten?
It's just an explanation of why it's redundant. And then the repealed section is the named section in the left-hand column.
See. Okay. Are there any questions about page 5?
On to page 6 and 7.
Please. I ask a question. You can ask. All right, on page 7, I think for the prescriptive coursework requirements, this is where we had a lot of conversation, but it didn't move forward into repealing anything or changing anything. So number 3, it says this board is now responsible for establishing those new standards for EPP program approval prior to these regulations being sunset in 2026. So that's like something when we think about what is something that we are going to come forth with and propose soon. That is one area that they're saying that it's too prescriptive of coursework and we should think of something else. Discuss.
Thankfully, based on the statute, I think we have until July 1st of 2025 to review reporting on the endorsement areas. Good. Yeah, so I think it's July 1st of 2025. So we do have time to kind of delve into that after we take care of the education preparation certification content.
The only thing with that, if we have to change something in legislation, we have to propose something before that, like that date, July 1st, 2025.
We'll be proposing in the fall. Yeah, for the
following session, so that it, okay.
And this is the longer session, and then I think the fall session is going to be the shorter session. Yeah. Is there any other questions or discussion on page 6 or 7? The next part is preparation, appeal 3 is preparation regulations of appeal on account of misalignment with existing policy. That's page 8 and page 9. Let me take a look at those two and see if there's any questions or discussion. One of the problems that I had on page 8 is the language or otherwise eliminated. This CAPE, if you eliminated these standards, then you would have to do nothing. And so it's almost like they or otherwise eliminated leaves nothing there.
Are you referring to the part where it says at the bottom of that main paragraph, or alternatively to allow those CAPE requirements to stand in place of the repealed regulations? That's the sentence.
Well, I was looking at the table, but that language refers to this, right? So identified as repealed in the paragraph above for a number of regulations, established standards prior to the formalization of the state's partnership with CAPE. So prior to the partnership with CAPE, there were standards that EPPs met. They're not CAPE standards, they were state standards, right? But they're saying in general, we want to see the new legislation that codifies existing CAPE requirements or allow those CAPE requirements to stand in place of the repealed regulations. But technically, that is what's happened, right? The CAPE requirements are the requirements for standards for parent teaching.
So I guess my complicated. And I think an extra question with that is, CAPE is for educator prep programs, but if we're saying certification includes coaches, that's CIAC. If it includes like all these other SL, like speech and language pathologists, that's a completely different group.
Right.
Administrators, superintendents.
Right. So I think that we can't just allow CAPE requirements to stand in place of the repealed regulations, that we need to have a lot more bodies involved, because I'm not sure if we can tell CIAC what their regulations for coaches should be.
Right.
I think this body was put together mostly dealing with like K-12 public education, teachers, educators that were certified in like this narrow band.
To add the accrediting we need to add additional accrediting bodies for all of the areas in which we're now responsible.
Or at least in whatever January memo we put, that is an issue that needs to be dealt with, that we can't cover through CAPE all of what they're asking us to do, because CAPE doesn't.
And I was surprised actually that the lawyer said that it was all those other areas, because the legislation does say educator preparation. And when you think of just the word educator, I don't always think of administrators fitting under that term, or coaches especially.
But
Can I speak to that?
administrators. Yes, please.
Yeah, so, yeah, I mean, this is a new, sort of a new regime in the law, and this board has concurrent authority with the state board to issue certification to educators. And CAPE, I think, is a very small part of this. CAPE just refers to, as I understand it, institutions and educator prep programs, okay? And what the language says, and again, this is Public Act 2441, Section 11, subsection A, that this board and the state board each have authority over educator preparation and certification. Okay, and certification, I think, as we're all starting to realize, is an exceedingly broad area. And it includes, you know, many, the majority of, you know, staff members in schools, and it does include, I think, coaches, and what exists in that current area is state board regulations. And those are, you know, we refer to those in shorthand as the certification regulations. And these are the things that haven't been amended since 1998. And I think that's ultimately what this board is charged with, along with the state board, to, you know, looking at and ultimately amending. But I would sort of respectfully say that CAPE is really a small part of this. And as I understand it, it really just refers to the educator prep side of things. But the certification side, you know, is at least as big, if not a bigger area. And, you know, it's all certified individuals in Connecticut is within the jurisdiction of this board, along with the state board.
I think for the purpose of what we are doing right now, it's going to be that pre-K through 12. And then we'll get the list of the other certifications that we have asked Chloe to get for us. And then we can start having those conversations about that after. But I think the question was, you know, if we, and correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Tichel, that if these are repealed, then there's nothing there but the CAPE standards. And I guess I would say, would we not look at those CAPE standards to see if they would then become not just a standard, but maybe part of the regulations or the guidelines for these things that are repealed?
Yes, except I think the point is that they don't apply in certain areas, right? So they're not applicable to.
But they are applicable to that pre-K through 12, yes? Yes. So that is kind of like where we're starting.
Yes.
And then, you know, the long game is going to be many other certifications that we will have to kind of delve into. So I think that when asking that question of if these are repealed, there's nothing to like have in place. But CAPE already has their standards. We can certainly look at those standards and decide if that is what we want for regulation or statute or guidance to replace these.
Or updating them.
For updating them, correct. I mean, they could definitely be like a starting point in having those conversations around that.
Yeah, and just thinking about when CAPE came in 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Maybe a little bit less. It was because, I mean, within the department, that to oversee the every single EPP in the state, it was just much easier and more aligned to have everybody go through CAPE as a national accrediting body. So I just want to name that so we don't go backwards, putting it back into Department of Education and like getting rid of CAPE altogether.
Oh, no, and part of the reason was the State Department didn't have the capacity to do this kind of accreditation. They used to do it actually in tandem with NCAPE, which was the prior accreditation. So the state board was very involved with accreditation and licensure up until maybe 2015.
Mm-hmm,
and then when CAPE took over, the state body legislation approved, that would be the accrediting body for any program that provided for training for life insurance. That would be. So you're right. It's only a small area. I think it's wise to focus on that right now. But I do think clarification on the broader piece and getting help from someone like Sue Pearl to kind of go through the regs again and see where the cleanup is needed.
Sure, isn't that critical? Our immediate ask of people is to go back to look at the administrator sections, because
that was the note
Lydia's point earlier, that we're one, do K-12, two, do administrators. We don't want to silo these in fragments, but we're using a very big piece of what we thought was already done for our January deadline. So the administrators.
And other supplemental teaching roles. I mean, there's so many.
And, but again, we can present what we have on that deadline and state that we have CPO working on, or whoever working on the other components, and that we would have to defer that update to them at another deadline. So even though this is kind of like a deadline that they've given us, it is not uncommon within the state to present what we do have, and then to kind of defer the other things, knowing that we are working on it and giving them an update on what we are working on to meet those deadlines later on.
I just want it to be very clear that it is piggybacking. It's too far down the road. I can kill things, but then without proper coverage. It's there.
We got somebody with their hand up on there.
So
Go ahead.
she works for the State Department of Education and she works for PPP programs.
Okay.
So she's asking
Hi
the
there.
children.
Am I muted or can you hear me?
We can hear you. Go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to point out that CAPE does accredit advanced programs. So when you're looking at the standards, there's initial certification standards, and then there's also the advanced standards. So things like 092 programs, administration, superintendency, reading and language arts consultant, school counseling, things of that nature would fall under the advanced programs. So they do accredit both initial teaching licensing programs as well as advanced programs. So that's just something to keep in mind when you look at the standards, that you'd also want to look at the advanced.
Go ahead, Lauren, finish.
Yeah, so that's just important to note. And then what they also do for things like speech pathology, school counseling, those entities that have additional accrediting bodies. So for example, speech pathology programs are accredited by something called ASHA. And this is sort of like getting into the accreditation weeds, but because CAPE is a CHIA recognized accreditor, when an EPP has a program, let's say in like speech pathology, for example, that if the speech pathology program is accredited by ASHA, then CAPE recognizes that accreditation. So I think it's just, as you're kind of thinking about all of this, and to one of the attorney's points, of course, CAPE is only just one role in this process. I just wanted to make sure that folks understood that they don't only accredit initial licensure programs. They also accredit advanced programs, but it's a separate set of standards. There's initial standards and then advanced standards. And then to Anne's earlier point that relative to what CAPE does do in terms of their standards, and also what they don't do, as you look at the regulations and the specificity of what you would want various content areas to have. Standard 1 is all around content. And it's important to note that each discipline, so thinking in terms of like art, English, science, music, all the various subject areas, there are bodies that have what are called SPAs, specialty program areas, and all of those bodies have national content standards. So when you look at Standard 1, it's just important to note that Standard 1 of CAPE speaks to content, but within that, every discipline has national content standards that EPP programs would align to. So for example, what would compromise comprise rather a secondary English program wouldn't necessarily be what a physical education program would be. So when you look at standard 1, if you're going to spend some time looking at the CAPE standards, you just would want to have that knowledge as well, that there are, what CAPE is looking at for standard 1 is sort of those discipline specific standard alignment. But mostly I just wanted to interject so that people knew that that CAPE has advanced standards as well and does accredit advanced programs.
Thank you for the clarification.
Yeah.
Any other?
It was a question, Lauren, as an EPP offering an elementary program or a secondary math program is required by the state to go through CAPE accreditation. Is that the same for the advanced programs or like speech pathology programs that they are required? There's already an identified accrediting body and there's only one that they go through?
So the requirement is that any EPP in the state of Connecticut is accredited by CAPE. So CAPE, if you think about it, accredits the whole institution, all of the educator preparation programs that are within it. I take that back, not the whole institution. Like if you're Quinnipiac University, their CAPE is accrediting all of the educator preparation programs, and institutions that, let's say, for example, have speech pathology, I'm just using that as an example, they have the option of either having CAPE review that program as part of the accreditation cycle or showing that that program, meaning the speech pathology program, is accredited by ASHA and therefore CAPE will recognize it. So the ones where you see that happen a lot are school counseling, because school counseling programs are typically accredited by something called KCREP, but they don't have to be necessarily. But to be eligible for educator licensure in the state, the institution has to have CAPE accreditation for whatever educator preparation programs they're offering. So they can't opt out. It's just that CAPE accepts the other CHIA recognized accreditor for, and it's literally just for standard 1 for that when they look at the sort of content specificity. Does that make sense? I know it's a little kind of in the weeds.
Very complicated, I know, and thank you for the clarification, Lauren, because you're right, the advanced programs also.
Yeah.
To add more complexity. The EPP itself, the education preparation itself, they make the choice between just using or using CAPE along with the standards for the specialty area. That's an option. So you don't have to go to the standards for certain areas. Like there are SNIAC standards for early childhood. You could use those to say, we're doing great work in early childhood. CAPE doesn't require you to do that as part of the accreditation model. So again, it's complicated. I think for our purposes here, there are CAPE standards. Standard 1 is the standard that addresses content, and it is very broad. It basically says, I mean, it's actually, I pulled it up. The provider ensures that candidates are able to apply their knowledge of learning in the appropriate levels. Candidates have developed an understanding of critical concepts and principles of their discipline. That kind of language is very broad. It's meant to be that broad so that each group then can decide what that means. Right? So I think for our purposes, we're looking at what content do either early, pre-K 6 people need or secondary need. We can decide how candidates would do their content knowledge. But CAPE doesn't require it. It requires that it be valid information and that it be reliable.
So I think once we get to that point, I think CAPE will definitely be a resource that we can look into in terms of some framework or some ideas to move that work forward.
to replace whatever might get repealed in that process. And it's good to know that it not only handles those additional, but also the advanced standards for certifications. And right now, I think our process is definitely going to be getting the list of certifications and contacting CMG if they're able to help us in that process of doing the same that they did for the document that we currently have for those other components of certification. Does that sound appropriate? And so if we can then move forward from there then to page 9, was there anything else, or should we move to table 4?
Sure, this is relevant. I'm sorry, this is really complicated. In E, F, and G, it refers to standard 6 of case. Not all EPPs have to meet standard 6. So just sort of not sure you're misaligned with Connecticut policies. This means this would go away.
I mean, it says the analysis of where existing regulations are misaligned with existing Connecticut policies. I'm not sure that it's saying that it would go away necessarily, but I think it's identifying where it's misaligned.
I thought this was what was repealed in the Public Act.
By the Public Act, these are.
This is what, right, this is now what is.
So I guess my question is, standard 6 is fiscal and administrative capacity. So what EPPs don't have to meet standard 6 then?
It's not that they don't have to meet it, but we're like a larger university like we're accredited by NETCHI. NETCHI is like approves the entire university. So they look at all the financials, they look at everything. Standard 6 looks at that as well. But if you're in a university in which NETCHI already did it, they say you're okay. That makes sense.
It's not that it's gone, it's just like.
Another body is doing that.
We take what you said for them.
Right, because otherwise it's like, well, which EPPs don't have to have fiscal and administrative capacity?
Really does.
Something, a program, an alternative program that's maybe not connected to the board. It doesn't have another level of approval. It just doesn't apply to everybody, but if this is going away.
I think page 10 is for regulations to be updated to reflect the board's responsibilities related to program approval. And be the area of concentration for us. Page 10.
It would be helpful to see what currently, I know that Lauren will have lots of details on this, but like a document that shows a new program, like this is what a new program needs to demonstrate to be able to enter it, because even a new program would then, there's a window of time to get CAPE accreditation for continuation. And so it'd be helpful to see, like, what does the department require for a new program? The latest and greatest, because that's changed a lot.
Is Lauren still on?
Yeah.
She's.
I'm still here. Yeah,
Continuing
I mean-
program or a new program approval is now not, but I'm not clear what the legislation to new program?
This current new change for so this section, in terms of the procedures of the process has not been repealed. So that's, I don't have the number in front of me, but I want to say it's 10145D9F was not repealed. So meaning that the procedures were not part of the clump of regulations that were repealed. That's just for the procedures, meaning that that it still has to be board approved before they can operate, all of that. So if you look at that memo that CPRL put forward, there's a lot of sections of 10145D9 that were repealed. But A, F, and G2 and G3 were not repealed. And G2 and 3 are for new programs at institutions that already exist, and then new programs in institutions that don't have any other approved programs. So there's documents on our website, and I can put the link in the chat that sort of includes what's looked at as and the current process for the new program approval process. Some of the work of this board, though, will impact how that work moves forward. So it will still be required that programs are board approved. And again, because G2 and G3 were not repealed, it sort of delineates the difference between full approval or provisional approval and probationary approval. Also, what was not repealed was the role that the review committee serves. So 10145D9F is the review committee, and that was not repealed either. So the CSDE review committee still is the body that makes the recommendation to the commissioner before a program goes forward to the board. But to Dr. Good's question, you know, so that sort of new program piece remains. What will change potentially is currently when a new program is reviewed at the sort of content level, what is looked at is its alignment to the regulations. So that will have to change after July 1, 2026, because those regulations are repealed. The practice has been to look to make sure that programs are aligned to the national content standard of the discipline. So that's what I was speaking to before. So for example, if you want to have a new program that certifies secondary English teachers, for example, the National Council of Teachers of English has professional standards for what, you know, a high quality English education program needs to have. And that relationship is then with CAPE Standard 1. So it's the expectation is new programs are aligned to the national content standards, to the regulations. That is the part that will have to change, as well as the CAPE standards. So some of the work that you all are going to be doing and thinking about is, in the absence of regulations, you know, will it be whatever you ultimately decide, but will it be the alignment to the national content standards and the CAPE standards, and then going, you know, to the review committee, to the commissioner, to the state board, or do you have other ideas of how you want that to look?
Okay, any further questions or discussion on page 10 in terms of table 4? Document, there is a back page on repeal regulations that may warrant consideration. And I think those were some that we just discussed on 10, 1.5D through 400A3, governing the of the code and professional responsibilities for teachers. And allocates the authority to review the code of professional responsibilities for the Connecticut Advisory Council for teacher professional standards, having been identified for the appeal. There's also 145D through 45D. So all things for us to consider, obviously, in terms of this meeting and our next steps. It sounds like our next steps are that we are contacting people on the other certifications, getting a list of certifications, And then I guess my question is, who does the work of creating the document with the regulations or fields, like the strikeouts, the enters in, like all the kind of things that are in here for us to review before presenting to the board? Does that happen?
Make a recommendation?
Sure.
I recommend we look to adopt CPRL's document as the task that is due at the end of January with modifications. We just kind of went through it. I feel like they've already captured a lot of what is due in January, plus what happened in the past to meet the requirements of what is due. Perhaps if we circulate this text of the work they've already done, highlight any areas that we want to have further conversation, that could be the framework of document that at least is the foundation for what we will submit at the end of January.
And I was also thinking, sorry. Our person is like, she oversees all the reports we have to send to the singers to come to the next meeting and kind of give an overview of what that could look like if we decide to utilize this. To see if this is something we can, but with a cover sheet, what does that look like? I think that would be helpful.
That meets most of the things that we have to do by January. But it doesn't necessarily do the other two items, which is review the state's approach to assessing minimum content knowledge and develop recommendations for alternatives to minimum content knowledge. So we can that could be something we do for part one, but then for the other two bits, I think we would have to have some unique work of our own as a board.
But in the report, we can say that we're going to work towards that and maybe even.
Could we put on, that's the idea for our next agenda, to begin reviewing the process to identify the that portion of the deadline. And then we can speak to reporting out, then we can have that at our next meeting or what I have in there. And then any bodies that need to be a part of that meeting for the minimum content knowledge assessment, who would be part of that meeting that we want to invite to have that discussion, as well as a possible alternative approaches to minimum content knowledge. We want at that meeting to potential experts in the room to provide some feedback and background knowledge on that. That'd be great.
January date of the
31st.
Our next meeting is the 13th of January.
CPRL has done analysis and they've shared looking at other states that have multiple measures for content knowledge. So even being able to they could give us here are the states that are currently doing it. And this is, like a little one pager on and this is how they did it. It would make our job much easier. So we're starting from a launching point.
Taking a look at potential ideas.
Yeah, maybe generate some ideas.
We just don't know, would this be enough time for CPRL to give us kind of like the certifications or put them in the task of that and do this by the next meeting, but
May I jump in?
Thank you. Yes, go ahead, sorry.
Hi. I'm curious as to why we would want to look into other states when we have such a robust, group of people here, and also just really great curriculum in our own state, and maybe just look at that here at home.
One thing I thought of was, are there any other states that have certification grade bands that for K to 6 and 4 to 12?
I was thinking of, we currently use the Praxis too. That's one way that we assess content knowledge. And I know that Colorado they launched a multi-measure where they also used the Praxis too, but then they have additional ways to demonstrate content knowledge. And so being able to, we have so much robust things here, yes, and there's other places that are using a similar test or test that we have used, potentially seeing, or what have they might have done something that doesn't work and we don't even want to go down that route. So that's why I would open it up to seeing, so we're not starting from scratch.
You can certainly add it as an item to review materials from other states, even if it's just to build capacity on the work that lays ahead.
That makes sense. Thank you. I'm glad I asked.
Sorry, I didn't get to you right away. My apologies.
I think another group that might be good to invite to speak with us, because we're supposed to be assessing our current, minimum content knowledge standards, that it might make sense to have people from the state who currently work on certification give us, this is the state of minimum content knowledge within endorsement areas. We require this. They could do a presentation saying, all right, for speech and language pathologists, they have to do X, Y, and Z. And I know that for school psychologists, there's like all additional certification things through other organizations. So the department that currently deals with certification would be a good group to invite in and give us, here's the state of what we're currently asking of our aspiring educator candidates. And then also have CPRL do an evaluation of what other states do to address minimum content knowledge. Because it might be like, all right, Praxis 2 for physics, but if you have a master's in physics, do you need to show you can do high school physics? I don't know. And so other states might have.
But in the department, yes, the certification folks, but we also have performance. And they've been doing some work with Praxis and some studies that's currently underway, but you could probably see what is actually being looked at, because we have been taking all the recommendations and suggestions and really working with Praxis to really look at the assessment and who was passing the position by and what would be done different. Just that having decision, that would be a G. Is there any further discussion on that or additions to that?
Are we thinking about all of the areas?
I think we're focusing on K through 12, but we're preparing to have the rest of those things be figure out how this is. And then we're kind of figuring out and preparing the materials for when we need to move to the other certifications as well.
The only recommendation I would make is, as we begin to think about this, is that there are two elements. One is because the accreditation for CAPE is the way that we can actually certify and license, and that's legislative law. That we need to think about what they minimally require. So they minimally require reliability and validity of the data, whatever data we use. So use Praxis, that's sort of given, but if we use something alternatively, we have to prove reliability and validity in order to use that to indicate content knowledge under the legislative requirement of accreditation. Right? So that's one important element of this. But then the other thing that I would say, as a body that's trying to be flexible and look towards the future, that the whole nature of knowledge has changed. And finding actual knowledge or knowledge simply from phones, let alone anything else. So taking into account that means that maybe it's guidance. Ultimately, maybe we keep it really minimal for what's required in content, so that the broader understanding of how knowledge has changed and really what to teach us. That's going to be an interesting conference. The more competency areas than this is specific. Right.
Well, broad. That's certainly a conversation that can come up when we get to that point in the discussion. I think right now we have to kind of prepare for the next meeting, and at the next meeting, we're hoping to have from CPRO, you know, a minimum content knowledge kind of audit in there. And then having representation from the State Department of Education around certification to come to the meetings to continue that conversation moving forward. And then to what Dr. Ritchie had said earlier, taking this document and adopting it as the framework for the first section of the statute. In agreement with that?
I just wonder if there's any other expertise, I'll say this simply, minimum content knowledge around what we teach, but also around how we teach, how a person teaches, the instructional practice the person teaches with.
That's actually like a separate spin.
That is for any EPP, the pedagogical approaches. If you are an approved CAPE, like school, that is, you have to approve both and content knowledge and pedagogical approaches. The question is, do we trust that when an EPP graduates a student, they successfully finish? Is that it? Or because I think the way we currently have it, we don't trust it 100%, and we put additional steps after somebody graduates to then check to see, are they really ready? We need those extra steps in between. It's a conversation for us all to consider.
And also further conversation too is, we're just giving that initial certificate. What is the next piece to that? And the responsibility of whoever's hiring, because there is a lot that happens already in school systems to support those individuals. And we can't lose sight of that. Our piece is just that initial piece, but there are other factors, contributing factors to supporting the growth in the capacity of workers that we can serve. There are other responsibilities, and school systems take that very seriously. There's a lot of work that happens with building capacity.
Keep thinking that the bullying is a boot camp. All right, so with that in mind, is there any further discussion on kind of like what our focus or our goal is going into the next meeting?
Just so I'm clear, for the next meeting is having Steve Rowland back to give a presentation on work that has been done in regards to minimum content knowledge, as well as I'm also the G, since he's been working.
Yes.
Data.
Needs our database.
And then having members of the certification department as well, to speak about the other pieces to certify. Want to make sure.
No, 100%. And then we'll have the final agenda as well that we'll discuss out.
I was also going to invite Laura to, and she could probably come towards the end and we figure out. If we're going to use pieces or what people has put together and how we present that in the next piece.
I think our first is going to be to learn that people has that information before we kind of like move into the rest of it. So once we hear that, we kind of set up a quick meeting for setting the agenda and the structure of the agenda and what flows from one to the next. In that respect. All right. Are there any other ideas, discussions, questions that need to come up at this time?
Hi everyone. I think for me, something that I'm thinking of that I just wanted to throw out there is maybe as we're looking at these things, also thinking about the differences between undergrad teacher prep programs and graduate teacher prep programs, as well as alternate routes. And just to throw that out there as we start looking at all of this for January.
Well, I would add that for January, we only have those 3 things on our list: the obsolete conflicting provisions, minimum content knowledge, and recommendations for alternatives. So I know there's much later deadlines for things like the regulations around EPPs. So I think for January, we should probably just focus on like the 3 things that have to get done timely. And because we will have the next 2.5 years to figure out some of those later pieces of this big, unimaginably big puzzle.
Yes, I agree with you. It's just that, you know, as the conversation was happening, I'm just trying to reflect on how that things might affect grad programs. I'm a graduate of ARC and I'm the ARC director. So, you know, I have a lot of knowledge around that and experience, personal experience with it. And, you know, thinking of that the content piece, you know, we really rely on the praxis to make sure that they have that so that we can teach them the instructional pieces in the 8 months that we have, for example. And, you know, however, other grad programs, a lot of people have degrees already in that content, but they may not, and they pass the praxis, and that's how we know because they don't have the degree. So it's just something like it's a lens that I'll have while we're looking at it. And I wanted to throw that out there for everyone else as well, because I think a lot of times we're thinking about teacher prep, we're thinking about those undergrad programs. And it's just something I want to keep at the forefront of all of our minds is all.
We appreciate that thought, and why we have a body that's so diverse with different stakeholders here is to make sure that those things are on the table and represented in the forefront of discussions that we do here. So I appreciate you bringing that up. As for now, though, I think I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
We have a hand raised.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Shannon. I didn't see.
Sorry.
you.
I was just going to say as some pre-reading for the next meeting, since the second task we have references 10-145F, which is the current kind of prescriptive section relative to content knowledge. It'd be good just to read that and know the current state with the acknowledgement that some of this is being repealed. Some of it is a decision that needs to be made, but for the most part, at a very general level, the demonstration of content knowledge has been assessed through a test, through it was practice 1 that then kind of has some new flexibilities to it with other ways to demonstrate the practice 1 basic knowledge, foundational knowledge, but then practice 2 or a related subject specific, content specific test is the way that you demonstrate content knowledge. And I think what's up for discussion is, are there other ways in which someone could demonstrate that? So digging into that section could just give a helpful, with the hopefully input of the certification office. I don't think it has to be the way that it's been. I think when we talked about it at the CECC, we were talking about more flexibilities to give people credit for ways that they've been able to demonstrate content knowledge that are not just limited to a test.
Right, and I think that, having our database that we have currently available to us also provides a lot of information on how successful some of the students are coming out of PPEs or EPPs, sorry. And, having those conversations around, what might be the hindrance and in what areas are there shortfalls and how can we support to ensure that all of our students are able to kind of meet those standards if that standard is the one that we want to continue with. Is there any further discussion? Okay, I see no more hands. Okay. I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Yes. All in favor? Any opposed? The abstention. All right, thank you, and we'll see you at the next meeting.